morning sun shone weakly through the tall windows of the city courthouse. Dust particles floated in the golden light, dancing slowly in the still air. It was early, yet the hallway outside was already crowded with people. Lawyers holding thick files, police officers standing straight in their uniforms, and families sitting quietly on the benches with nervous faces. The sound of footsteps, whispers, and papers shuffling filled the air. It was another ordinary day in court, but no one knew that this day would soon become unforgettable. Inside Courtroom 3, the air felt heavy, as if it carried the weight of 100 untold stories. A tall man in a black robe entered through the side door, and everyone stood up immediately. It was Judge Harrison, a man known throughout the city for his serious face, deep voice, and strict sense of justice. He had been a judge for almost 20 years, and people respected him, though some feared him too. He believed in law, order, and discipline. To him, justice was not about feelings. It was about rules. He always said, "If you break the law, you pay the price." Judge Harrison sat down on the high wooden bench, adjusted his glasses, and looked around the room. His eyes were sharp and his expression gave nothing away. The clerk handed him the schedule for the day's hearings. One case after another, theft, fraud, assault, just like every other day. He sighed quietly, thinking about how people never learned. The courtroom slowly filled up. The sound of shoes clicking on the floor echoed as people took their seats. On the left side sat lawyers, ready with their files and notes. On the right side, a few reporters whispered among themselves, always hungry for a story. Near the back, a small group of law students watched eagerly, their notebooks open, ready to learn from a real judge in action. In the middle of all this, a young man entered quietly. He was tall, neatly dressed in a dark blue suit with a calm and confident look. His name was Marcus Reed. He walked with the ease of someone who belonged there, though no one seemed to notice him at first. He found a seat near the front, placed his briefcase beside him, and waited patiently. But in the busy courtroom, appearances could be deceiving. To most people there, Marcus looked like just another defendant, maybe someone about to face a serious charge. His calmness was mistaken for arrogance, and his confidence was misread as defiance. A few people in the back whispered to each other, wondering what crime he might have committed. Judge Harrison glanced up briefly when he noticed Marcus standing. Without checking the full details on his desk, the judge assumed the man in front of him was next on the list. Another case, another criminal, another sentence to deliver. His tone was cold and distant as he spoke. Name? Before Marcus could answer, the judge continued reading from the papers in front of him. His voice carried through the room, firm and powerful, commanding silence. Everyone listened carefully. For Judge Harrison, this was routine. One case after another. Justice delivered quickly. No time wasted. The courtroom clerk moved around, placing files, adjusting the microphone, and whispering updates to the judge. The atmosphere was professional but tense. You could almost hear the heartbeat of the people waiting for their turn. Every eye in the room watched the judge, his expressions, his tone, his every move. He was like a conductor leading an orchestra of justice, and no one dared interrupt him. Meanwhile, Marcus kept his head high, showing no fear or anger. There was something quiet but strong about him, something that made a few people in the crowd curious. Who was this man? Why did he look so calm? His suit was too fine for a regular defendant, and his voice, when he finally spoke, carried confidence, the kind of voice used to giving orders, not receiving them. But Judge Harrison didn't notice any of that yet. His mind was already locked in its usual rhythm. Read the file, judged the case, deliver the sentence. To him, this was just another day in the pursuit of justice. He believed his decisions were fair, his words final, and his courtroom a place where the law ruled above all else. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Each second felt heavy. The audience barely moved, afraid to even cough. Then the judge leaned forward, ready to begin what he thought was another sentencing. The tension in the air grew thicker. For a moment, Marcus looked up and studied the man on the bench. He recognized him, not personally but by reputation. Judge Harrison was known as the Iron Judge, famous for his severe punishments and lack of leniency. Marcus had heard stories about him in the legal world. Never did he imagine he would stand face to face with him under such strange circumstances. The courtroom door creaked open one last time, as a few latecomers slipped inside, taking their seats quietly. Outside, the city continued its usual noise: car horns, footsteps, and distant chatter. But inside the courtroom, time felt frozen. Everyone's attention was on the judge and the man before him. No one knew that within the next few minutes everything would change. The judge, the courtroom, the people, all would witness a moment that would shake their faith in assumptions and open their eyes to a deeper truth. As the judge lifted his gavel slightly, ready to speak, the silence became unbearable. A few breaths held in, a few eyes widened in curiosity. The courtroom had begun its day like any other, but destiny had already written a story far different from what anyone expected. The heavy courtroom doors opened with a soft creak. Everyone turned their heads slightly as a man stepped inside. His footsteps were calm but firm, echoing faintly against the marble floor. He wasn't escorted by police, nor did he seem nervous. He walked with quiet confidence, as if he had walked into many courtrooms before. His name was Marcus Reed. Marcus was dressed in a sharp navy blue suit that fit him perfectly. A silver watch gleamed on his wrist, and his polished shoes reflected the light from above. His calm expression didn't match the tension in the room. Some people assumed he was another defendant, maybe a businessman caught in a crime or a witness about to face questioning. But Marcus wasn't like the others waiting for judgment. He was there for a reason no one in that room could imagine. The clerk glanced at him, then back at the papers, a bit confused. She wasn't sure if he was the defendant for the next hearing or one of the attorneys. Before she could clarify, Judge Harrison raised his head and noticed Marcus standing. The judge didn't recognize him. He saw only what his eyes told him: a tall, black man standing alone before the bench. And in that moment, his assumptions filled in the rest. The judge cleared his throat. "Step forward," he said firmly. Marcus obeyed without hesitation. His steps were steady. His eyes met the judge's, not with defiance, but with quiet respect. He could sense the tension in the air, could feel the judgment before a word was spoken. It wasn't new to him. He had felt that same look before, on the streets, in meetings, in the eyes of people who saw only his skin before his story. The audience in the courtroom whispered among themselves. Some craned their necks for a better look. Others shook their heads as if already knowing the outcome. "Another one," someone murmured softly, their tone heavy with prejudice. Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses and began flipping through the file in front of him. But the papers didn't match the man standing before him. They belonged to someone else, another case entirely. Still, the judge didn't notice. His voice boomed across the room, cold and powerful. "Marcus Reed," he said, misreading the situation completely. "You stand before this court accused of serious misconduct. Do you have anything to say before sentencing?" Marcus blinked in surprise. His eyebrows lifted slightly. He opened his mouth to respond, but stopped. He realized what was happening. The judge had mistaken him for a defendant. For a brief second, Marcus considered correcting him immediately, but something inside him told him to wait. The silence stretched. You could almost hear the sound of pens stopping mid-note, the quiet rustle of clothing as people leaned forward. Everyone expected Marcus to beg for leniency or start defending himself. But he didn't. He stood there calmly, studying the man who held the gavel, this man who didn't even bother to check the facts before passing judgment. The judge's expression hardened. He mistook Marcus's calm for arrogance. "Nothing to say?" Judge Harrison's voice grew sharper. "Very well. It seems you have no remorse for your actions." A few gasps rippled through the room. One of the assistants tried to interrupt. "Your Honor, I think—" But the judge raised his hand to silence her. Marcus took a slow breath. He didn't want to embarrass the judge in front of everyone. Years of working in the legal system had taught him patience. He knew that sometimes silence spoke louder than protest. He waited, letting the moment unfold naturally. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his tone like a hammer striking the air. "This court cannot tolerate behavior that undermines justice. I hereby sentence you to—" The door at the side of the courtroom burst open before he could finish. A young clerk rushed in, papers clutched tightly in his hands, his face pale with panic. "Your Honor," he exclaimed, "that's not the defendant. Mr. Reed is the prosecutor for the next case." For a moment, time froze. The judge's gavel hovered in the air. His mouth stayed slightly open, words stuck in his throat. The courtroom fell completely silent. So silent that even the ticking clock seemed to hesitate. Judge Harrison's eyes darted from the clerk to Marcus, then back to the file. He read the first page carefully this time, and his face drained of color. The realization hit him like a cold wave. He had just delivered a harsh speech and nearly a sentence to the man who was supposed to stand beside him in the pursuit of justice. Marcus didn't move. He didn't smile, didn't frown. His face remained calm, almost serene, but inside his heart was heavy. Not with anger, but with disappointment. He had seen this too many times, people making judgments before knowing the truth. The judge lowered his gavel slowly. His voice cracked slightly when he finally spoke. "Mr. Reed." But Marcus gently raised his hand. "It's all right, Your Honor," he said quietly, his voice steady and kind. "It happens more often than you think." The courtroom erupted into uneasy murmurs. Some people looked ashamed. Others couldn't meet Marcus's eyes. The judge sat there, silent, unable to find the right words. For a man who had delivered countless verdicts, this was the first time he felt truly judged. By his own conscience. Marcus turned slightly, glanced at the audience, and then back at the judge. "Maybe today will remind us all," he said softly, "that justice begins with understanding, not assumption." The words hung in the air, powerful and unforgettable. The courtroom, once filled with judgment, now echoed with reflection. And that was how the day truly began. Not with a trial, but with a lesson. The courtroom was still. The judge's gavel rested in his hand, but his authority suddenly felt smaller, almost fragile. His eyes, once sharp and commanding, now flickered with doubt. The silence in the room was heavy enough to feel. Even the sound of breathing seemed too loud. Judge Harrison stared at Marcus Reed, his mind racing. How could this have happened? How had he, of all people, made such a careless mistake? He prided himself on being fair and thorough, but in one impulsive moment he had exposed his own weakness. Marcus stood quietly, not angry, not defensive. There was something about his calmness that made the moment even more powerful. He wasn't there to humiliate anyone. He had seen this kind of misunderstanding before, just never in a place where truth was supposed to rule above all. The clerk at the judge's side shifted nervously, whispering, "Your Honor, Mr. Reed is the lead prosecutor for the next case." The file mix-up caused the confusion. The judge didn't respond immediately, his lips pressed together, his throat tight. He looked down at the papers again, reading every line carefully this time, hoping to find some justification for his assumption, but there was none. The truth was simple and brutal. He had judged the man before him without knowing who he really was. A few people in the courtroom exchanged awkward glances. Some looked at Marcus with new respect, others with quiet embarrassment. The moment revealed something deeper than a mistake. It revealed how easily bias could slip through even the most disciplined minds. Judge Harrison finally cleared his throat. "Mr. Reed," he began, but his voice lacked the confidence it usually carried. "It appears there has been a misunderstanding." Marcus nodded slowly. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, his tone polite but steady. "It appears so." The simplicity of his response cut deeper than any accusation could have. He didn't need to say more. The silence said everything. The judge leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of his own words from just minutes earlier. The harsh lecture he had given, about responsibility, about being a repeat offender, echoed mockingly in his mind. He had spoken those words with certainty, with moral authority. Now they sounded hollow. He tried to regain his composure. "I assure you, Mr. Reed, this court holds you in the highest—" Marcus interrupted softly but respectfully. "Your Honor, there's no need for explanations. Mistakes happen. We're all human." But the way he said "we're all human" lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. Everyone understood what he meant, even if he didn't say it directly. The reporters in the back began scribbling notes furiously. They knew a story when they saw one. This wasn't just a courtroom error. It was a moment of truth, a mirror held up to the justice system itself. Marcus looked around the room, the jurors, the assistants, the onlookers. He could feel their discomfort. Yet, instead of anger, he felt a quiet sadness. He had dedicated his career to fighting for fairness, to making sure justice wasn't clouded by race or background. And yet, here he was, standing in the very system he served, mistaken for a criminal because of the color of his skin. He took a slow breath and said gently, "Your Honor, I understand that mistakes happen, but sometimes the smallest assumption can reveal the biggest truth. The judge looked down again, unable to meet Marcus's eyes. His hand gripped the gavel, not to strike it, but to keep it from trembling. No one spoke. The clerk's pen had stopped moving. The audience seemed frozen in time. Even the air felt still, as if the courtroom itself was holding its breath. Finally, Judge Harrison managed to whisper, "You are right, Mr. Reed." He paused. The words felt strange in his mouth, words of humility instead of command. "I judged you before I knew you." "That was wrong." Marcus gave a small, understanding nod. "Acknowledging it," he said quietly, "is the first step toward changing it." For a long moment, neither man moved. They simply stood there, two figures from opposite sides of the same system, facing an uncomfortable truth together. Then the judge, visibly shaken, said, "This court owes you an apology," the audience murmured softly. Some people nodded in agreement. Others looked down, ashamed of their earlier assumptions. Marcus didn't gloat or smile. He simply said, "Apology accepted, Your Honor." He turned and began walking back to his seat. Every step echoed in the silent courtroom like a heartbeat. The very same people who had looked at him with suspicion a few minutes ago now looked at him with awe. They saw his strength, his grace, his quiet power. When Marcus sat down, he placed his briefcase on the table, opened it calmly, and began reviewing the next case's notes. For him, the job wasn't about pride or revenge, it was about justice. And justice didn't stop because of one man's mistake. The judge, meanwhile, couldn't concentrate. His thoughts kept circling back to that moment of misjudgment. He had always believed that prejudice was something that existed out there, in others, not in himself. But today it had found its way into his courtroom. Into him. The courtroom began to breathe again. The clerk called for the next case. The sound of papers rustled once more, but something inside that room had changed. Everyone could feel it. As the proceedings continued, Judge Harrison glanced at Marcus several times, his expression no longer of authority but of respect. For the first time he saw not a defendant, not a black man, not a case file, but a fellow officer of the law, a man of dignity, intelligence, and calm strength. Outside, the city carried on as usual, unaware that inside courtroom 3, something had shifted forever. A lesson had been learned, not through punishment or law, but through a simple, human moment of truth. And deep inside, both men knew this was only the beginning. The room was quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. It wasn't peaceful, it was thick with tension and regret. Judge Harrison sat high on the bench, but his heart felt heavy. The robe that once gave him authority now felt like a weight pressing on his shoulders. Every time he looked at Marcus Reed, the memory of his own words echoed in his head like a haunting voice. Repeat offenders. Accountability. Harsh punishment. Those were his own words. Words he had thrown out carelessly, not knowing the truth. He looked down at the wooden desk before him. The gavel rested near his hand, its smooth handle cold and uninviting. For the first time in years, Judge Harrison didn't feel like a judge. He felt like a man who had failed his own principles. The courtroom clerk spoke softly. "Your Honor, shall we proceed with the next hearing?" The judge hesitated. His voice, once so strong, came out quiet. "Yes." "Call the case." The clerk called out the next file. Ironically, it was State versus Darren Cole, a real case and one where Marcus Reed was the lead prosecutor. The same man the judge had just almost sentenced by mistake now stood ready to represent justice. Marcus rose calmly, his expression unreadable. He carried himself with quiet dignity, his briefcase in one hand, papers neatly stacked in the other. There was no trace of anger or pride, only focus, only purpose. He walked toward the front, stood tall, and said clearly, "Ready to proceed, Your Honor." The words struck the judge's heart like lightning. The very man he had condemned moments ago now stood before him as a representative of the law, of truth, of fairness, of justice. It was poetic. It was painful. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "Proceed," he said, though his voice trembled slightly. As Marcus began his opening statement, the courtroom listened with full attention. His tone was steady, confident, and filled with integrity. Every word carried weight. He spoke about evidence, fairness, and the importance of the law being equal for all. But behind those words, everyone could sense something deeper, something unspoken. It was as if his voice carried a message not just for the jury, but for the judge himself. Justice, Marcus said firmly, is not about what we see. It's about what we choose to understand. The room went still. The line hung in the air, heavy with meaning. It wasn't directed at anyone, but everyone knew who it was meant for. Judge Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His fingers tapped lightly on the wooden bench. He wanted to respond, to acknowledge what had happened, but he couldn't. Not now, not in front of everyone. So he sat quietly, listening, learning. As the case continued, the judge's mind drifted. He couldn't stop thinking about how close he had come to humiliating an innocent man, a respected prosecutor no less. How often, he wondered, had others suffered that same fate without the chance to speak, without someone to correct the record? He thought about the faces that had passed through his courtroom over the years. The tired mothers, the scared teenagers, the men whose eyes carried stories he never cared to hear. Had he judged them too quickly? Had he been too harsh because it was easier than understanding? The thought burned inside him like a slow fire. The courtroom proceeded with its usual rhythm. Questions, objections, rulings. But inside the judge, something was changing. His heart, once guarded by pride and procedure, began to soften. Marcus continued to present his arguments with calm confidence. His words were sharp yet graceful, his reasoning flawless. Even those who had doubted him earlier now watched in admiration. They saw a man who carried his dignity not as a shield, but as proof of his strength. At one point, when the defense attorney raised an objection, Marcus paused, smiled slightly, and said, "Respectfully, Your Honor, I'll withdraw that question." The politeness in his tone, the professionalism in his behavior, it made the judge's chest tighten with guilt. This was a man who had every right to be angry, but instead he chose grace. When the court took a short recess, Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, staring blankly at the wall. The words "harsh sentence" kept repeating in his mind. He had always believed strictness was justice, but today he realized that harshness without understanding was not justice, it was blindness. During the break, Marcus stood near the window looking out at the gray sky. The light from outside fell softly on his face. He looked thoughtful but calm. He knew the judge was watching him, and though he didn't turn around, he spoke quietly, as if to no one in particular. "Sometimes," he said softly, "people don't realize how deep a single judgment can cut." The judge's breath caught. He wanted to apologize again, to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if agreeing with the truth of what he had just heard. When court resumed, the proceedings went smoothly. The professionalism between the two men, one behind the bench, the other before it, was unshakable. But beneath the surface, a new understanding had formed, an invisible bridge built from humility and forgiveness. As the day ended and Marcus gathered his things, the judge finally spoke. His voice was quiet but sincere. "Mr. Reed," he said, "today, you taught me something about justice that no law book ever could." Marcus turned to him with a small, knowing smile. "Then I'm glad this day happened, Your Honor," he said gently, "because real justice begins when we start to see each other clearly." For a long moment, neither man spoke again. The courtroom emptied slowly, leaving only the echo of their words behind. And though the world outside carried on as usual, inside both their hearts, something had changed forever. The air in the courtroom felt lighter now, but the weight of what had happened earlier still lingered like a shadow no one could ignore. The people who had witnessed the mix-up whispered softly among themselves during the short recess. Some were shocked, others embarrassed. They had seen something they would never forget. A man of justice making a mistake so human, so revealing, that it had silenced an entire courtroom. When the recess ended, everyone returned to their seats. The echo of footsteps on the marble floor faded as the doors closed. Judge Harrison entered again, slower this time, his usual confidence replaced by quiet thoughtfulness. He adjusted his robe, sat down, and looked at Marcus Reed, who was already standing at his place near the front. The case was still in progress, but the atmosphere had changed. The courtroom wasn't just a place of law anymore. It had become a stage for truth, vulnerability, and redemption. Marcus continued to present the evidence for the current case with precision and calm authority. His voice was steady, clear, and respectful. He spoke as a man who loved justice, who believed deeply in fairness, not just for himself but for everyone. The jury watched him closely, impressed by his confidence. Even those who had judged him earlier, assuming he was a criminal, now saw a different picture, a man who stood taller than prejudice. As Marcus spoke, Judge Harrison listened intently. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rush. He studied the man's words, his manner, his sincerity. It was strange. He had seen hundreds of prosecutors over the years, but none had made him feel this much reflection. Then, as Marcus finished presenting a crucial piece of evidence, something unexpected happened. The young court clerk, the same one who had corrected the judge earlier, stepped forward again, carrying a new file. He looked nervous but determined. "Your Honor," he said softly, "there's something you should see." The judge nodded and the clerk handed him the file. The judge opened it and froze. His eyes widened slightly. Inside the file was a detailed profile of Marcus Reed, his background, achievements, and service record. He was more than just a prosecutor. He was one of the youngest to be promoted in his district. He had graduated top of his class from Harvard Law. He had worked on several landmark cases involving civil rights and wrongful convictions. He was even recognized by the state for his work toward fair sentencing reforms. Each line the judge read made his throat tighten. This man, the same man he had judged by sight alone, was not only innocent but extraordinary. He wasn't just a good lawyer. He was one of the best in the field. The courtroom grew still again as the judge flipped through the pages. He could feel every eye in the room watching him. He cleared his throat, but his voice trembled when he finally spoke. "Mr. Reed," he began quietly, I was unaware of your record and your accomplishments." Marcus looked up, calm as ever. "That's all right, Your Honor. You weren't required to know. You only needed to listen." Those words landed softly, but their meaning struck hard. The judge nodded slowly, his lips pressed together. He felt a wave of humility wash over him. The very man he had misjudged now stood before him as a living reminder of how dangerous assumptions could be. The clerk stepped back, unsure if he had done the right thing by revealing the file. But Marcus gave him a small, reassuring nod as if to say, "You did what was needed." The room was silent again, so quiet that you could hear the faint ticking of the old clock on the wall. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his hands clasped. "Mr. Reed," he said, this time with genuine respect, "you've shown me today that justice is not only written in law books, it lives in the way we treat one another." Marcus gave a humble smile. "That's all I've ever tried to remind people of, Your Honor." A few people in the audience wiped away tears. Even the defense attorney, who had been silent until now, looked down, shaken by the human weight of the moment. The judge continued, his tone more personal now. "When I first saw you, I thought I knew your story. I thought I could read it in your appearance, in the way you stood. But I was wrong." He paused, his voice lowering. "And for that I owe not just you but this courtroom, a lesson in humility." Marcus didn't reply immediately. He simply nodded, his eyes steady. "Sometimes," he said softly, "life teaches us lessons in ways we don't expect. What matters is what we do after learning them." Those words seemed to fill the room with warmth. The judge took a deep breath, as if letting go of years of pride in that one moment. He looked at Marcus not as a superior or an equal, but as a teacher. The court session continued, but it no longer felt like a trial. It felt like transformation. The walls that had heard countless arguments and verdicts that day had instead witnessed something much greater, a moment of awakening. As the gavel finally came down, signaling the end of the day, the sound was softer than usual. It didn't echo with finality. It carried peace. When everyone began leaving, the judge called out quietly, "Mr. Reed." Marcus turned around. The judge stood, stepping down from the bench, something he rarely did. He extended his hand. "Thank you," he said simply, "for your patience, for your grace, and for reminding me what justice truly means." Marcus shook his hand, firm and respectful. "You're welcome, Your Honor. Justice is not about perfection, it's about growth." And with that, he picked up his briefcase, nodded once, and walked out of the courtroom. The crowd parted silently as he passed. The judge watched him go, the sound of Marcus's steady footsteps fading down the hall. He stood there for a long moment, alone in his thoughts, realizing that sometimes the greatest verdicts are not delivered, but learned. The courtroom was empty now. The The wooden benches that had been packed with people just an hour ago sat in silence. Papers were scattered across the tables, a few pens left behind, the faint hum of the ceiling fan filling the space with a lonely rhythm. The echo of voices, arguments, gasps, whispers, still seemed to linger in the air, refusing to fade away completely. Judge Harrison sat alone on the bench, his robe wrinkled, his hands folded tightly together. For years this courtroom had been his kingdom, a place where he felt in control, powerful, certain, but now for the first time he felt small, like a man stripped of all armor, left face to face with his own reflection. The file of Marcus Reed still lay open before him. He stared at it for a long time. The words on the page blurred and reappeared as he blinked, but one line kept drawing his eyes back again and again. Assistant District Prosecutor, known for advocating fairness in sentencing. Fairness. The very thing he had failed to give. He leaned back slowly in his chair, exhaling a breath that felt heavy with regret. The courtroom that once symbolized justice now felt like a mirror, showing him his flaws in the clearest light. For years, Judge Harrison had believed his judgments were pure and objective. He had told himself that emotion was weakness, that the law was meant to be cold and precise. But Marcus's calm eyes and gentle words had shaken that belief to its core. He could still hear Marcus's voice, quiet, respectful, yet filled with truth. Justice begins with understanding, not assumption. That sentence repeated in his mind like a slow echo. Each time he heard it, it hit a little deeper, peeling away layers of pride he didn't even know he had. He thought about the hundreds of faces that had stood before him over the years. How many of them had he really seen? How many had he judged too quickly because of how they looked, spoke, or stood? He swallowed hard, his chest tightening. Maybe Marcus wasn't the first man he had misjudged. Maybe he was just the first to make him realize it. He removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, feeling the sting of tiredness mixed with shame. He wanted to forget the morning, but his conscience wouldn't let him. It replayed every word, every look, every assumption. Outside the tall windows, the sun was setting. The orange light spilled into the room, falling across the judge's face, painting half of it in gold, the other half in shadow. It was as if the light itself was judging him too, revealing the man behind the robe. The silence around him was deep, yet it wasn't empty. It spoke to him. It forced him to listen, to himself. He thought about his father, a stern man who had raised him to believe that emotions had no place in justice. Be firm, his father used to say. Never let them see weakness. For years he had lived by that rule, and maybe, just maybe, that rule had blinded him. A knock came at the door. It was the clerk holding her bag. "Your Honor, we're closing up for the night," she said softly. The judge nodded. "Yes, of course." She hesitated at the doorway. "Sir," she said gently, "Mr. Reed." "He left a message for you." He looked up quickly. "A message?" She handed him a small folded note, written neatly in blue ink. Then she smiled faintly and left. The judge opened the note slowly, his heart pounding. The handwriting was clean and confident. "We all make mistakes, Your Honor. What defines us is how we grow from them. Marcus Reed." He stared at the words for a long moment, his throat tightening. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pity. It was grace. The kind of grace that forgives without judgment. He folded the note carefully and placed it inside the breast pocket of his robe, over his heart. For some reason, that felt right. He rose from his chair, the sound of it scraping softly against the floor. He walked to the window and looked out at the city lights beginning to flicker in the distance. Cars passed by below, people hurried across the streets. Life moved on, but he felt frozen in that one humbling realization. He whispered to himself, "I was wrong." The words were soft, almost like a confession. He had spoken thousands of sentences in his life, but this one felt the most honest. For years he had prided himself on being the voice of justice. But tonight justice had spoken back, and it had come through the voice of the very man he had misjudged. The judge stayed there for a long time, watching the light fade into darkness. The sound of the clock ticking was the only reminder that time was still moving. He didn't try to stop it. He needed this silence, this stillness to feel the full weight of his lesson. When he finally turned to leave, he glanced one last time at the empty chairs, the bench, the gavel. Everything looked the same, but he knew nothing was the same. Tomorrow, when he sat there again, he would be a different man. A better one. He picked up his coat, walked toward the door, and paused. His hand rested on the knob for a moment. Then he smiled faintly and whispered almost to himself, "Thank you, Marcus." The door closed softly behind him, and in that empty courtroom, the silence remained, no longer cold, no longer accusing, but peaceful. It was the silence of change, of realization, of a man who had finally understood what justice truly meant. The next morning, the city awoke as it always did, cars honking, newspapers hitting doorsteps, and the sound of footsteps echoing through downtown streets. But inside the courthouse, something felt different. The marble floor seemed quieter, the walls more thoughtful. Word had already spread about what had happened the day before. The judge who had nearly sentenced the wrong man, and the prosecutor who had responded with dignity instead of anger. By the time Judge Harrison arrived, the courtroom was already half full. Reporters filled the back rows, their cameras ready, pens hovering over notepads. Lawyers whispered among themselves. Even court staff, usually numb to drama, couldn't hide their curiosity. Judge Harrison walked in slowly, holding his files close to his chest. His expression wasn't stern or proud today, it was humble. The usual sharpness in his eyes had softened into reflection. He took his seat, placed the gavel down carefully, and looked across the room. There near the front stood Marcus Reed, calm as always. His navy blue suit looked crisp, his briefcase resting neatly by his chair. He turned slightly as the judge entered, their eyes meeting for the briefest moment. There was no bitterness in Marcus's gaze, only quiet respect. The judge cleared his throat. "Court is now in session," he said softly. But instead of moving straight to the first case, he paused. His fingers gripped the edge of the bench, and for a second he seemed unsure. Then he took a deep breath and spoke again. "Before we begin," he said, his voice echoing gently through the room, "I have something to say." The whispers stopped instantly. Even the air seemed to still. "I have been a judge for 23 years, he began, his tone heavy with sincerity. "In that time I have prided myself on being fair, on seeing clearly, on upholding the principles of justice without bias." He paused, looking down for a moment. "But yesterday I failed those principles." Every eye in the room was fixed on him. Marcus watched quietly, his hands folded. The judge continued, his voice shaking slightly now. "I made a grave mistake. I judged a man before I knew him. I let my assumptions speak louder than my duty. And that man, instead of responding with anger, responded with grace." You could feel the emotion rising in the room, the sound of a few people shifting in their seats, one woman quietly exhaling. Judge Harrison looked up, his eyes meeting Marcus's directly. "Mr. Reed," he said, "I owe you not just an apology, but gratitude. You reminded me what justice truly is, not power, not punishment, but understanding." Marcus blinked slowly, his expression calm but deeply moved. The judge's voice softened. "Yesterday I spoke words I cannot take back, but I can choose what I do next. And I choose to acknowledge my mistake, publicly, so that everyone who serves this court may remember that justice is blind, but judges must not be." There was a long silence. Even the reporters, usually quick to break the tension, stayed still, their pens frozen mid-air. Marcus stood slowly. "Your Honor," he said respectfully, "your words mean more than you know. I didn't expect an apology, but I do appreciate it." The judge nodded slightly. "You deserve it." Marcus continued, his voice calm but steady. "The truth is, bias doesn't always come from hatred. Sometimes it comes from habit, from years of seeing the same faces, the same stories, until we forget that every person is different. What matters is whether we learn when we're shown our error." His words filled the room with warmth, simple, honest, and profound. The judge looked down for a moment, then back at Marcus. "You've taught me more in one day than I've learned in my entire career," he said quietly. Marcus smiled faintly. "Then it was a good day, Your Honor." A few people chuckled softly, but it wasn't laughter, it was relief. The kind that comes after a storm finally passes. The judge straightened his back and turned to address the entire courtroom. "Let this be a reminder to all of us, lawyers, clerks, jurors, and myself, and that justice begins not when we speak, but when we listen." He took the gavel in his hand, paused, then said with conviction, This court stands not only for the law, but for learning. He brought the gavel down softly. The sound echoed, not with power this time, but with peace. As the morning session resumed, people whispered quietly about what they had just witnessed. Some said they had never seen a judge apologize like that. Others said it was the most human moment they'd ever seen in a courtroom. Marcus returned to his seat, opened his file, and began preparing for the next case. His movements were calm and focused, but deep down he knew something had changed, not just for the judge, but for everyone who had seen what real humility looked like. When the session ended, as people began filing out, Judge Harrison stood once more. "Mr. Reed," he said gently. Marcus turned. The judge stepped down from the bench and walked toward him. It was rare for a judge to descend from his seat. Rarer still to do it for this reason. He extended his hand once again. "I can't change what happened yesterday," the judge said, "but I can make sure it never happens again." Marcus shook his hand firmly. "That's all anyone could ask for, Your Honor." They stood there for a brief moment, two men, one who had delivered thousands of judgments, and one who had just taught him the most important one. As Marcus walked out of the courtroom, the morning sunlight spilled through the tall windows, wrapping the room in golden light. For the first time in years, Judge Harrison smiled, not as a man of authority, but as a man who had finally found truth in humility. And in that quiet courtroom, something sacred had been restored: respect, equality, and the real meaning of justice. Days passed, but the memory of that courtroom moment refused to fade. The video of Judge Harrison's public apology spread like wildfire across social media. News channels replayed it with dramatic headlines. "Judge humbles himself before prosecutor after mistaken judgment." Some called it a scandal, others called it redemption. But for many people it was something more. A reminder that humanity still had a voice, even inside a system known for its coldness. Marcus Reed didn't care for the attention. He had never sought fame or praise. While reporters crowded outside his office, he quietly went back to work, reviewing case files, helping interns, and mentoring young attorneys. When asked for interviews, he always gave the same calm answer. "The story isn't about embarrassment. It's about awareness. Everyone makes mistakes, but not everyone learns from them." Those words echoed across the internet, turning him into an unexpected symbol of grace and professionalism. People admired how he handled the situation, with strength, not anger, with understanding, not revenge. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, something remarkable began to happen. The atmosphere felt different. The staff, who once worked like emotionless machines, started looking at each other, really seeing each other. Conversations became more thoughtful. Clerks double-checked files more carefully. Lawyers spoke with a little more patience. Even Judge Harrison changed profoundly. He wasn't the same man who had sat on that bench weeks ago. The pride that once guided his decisions had been replaced by empathy. His voice, once hard and commanding, now carried warmth and reflection. He started arriving earlier than usual, spending quiet moments in his chambers, rereading old case files. Sometimes he found sentences he had written years ago, strict, cold words delivered without mercy. Now when he read them, they stung. He began attending legal seminars not as a speaker but as a listener. He asked younger judges for their perspectives, invited public defenders to share their challenges, and even met with advocacy groups working to reform sentencing policies. He told them, "Justice isn't a wall we hide behind. It's a bridge we must build," again and again. Those who knew him were stunned. The man once known as the Iron Judge had become one of the most compassionate voices in the court system. Marcus noticed the change too. A few weeks after the apology, he crossed paths with Judge Harrison again in a hallway. They exchanged a simple nod. No grand speeches, no ceremony. Just a quiet acknowledgement between two men who had been changed by the same moment. Later that day, Marcus spoke at a community event for law students. The auditorium was full, young faces eager to hear from the man who had stood tall when the system faltered. He stood on stage, microphone in hand, and began in his calm, steady voice. "Justice," he said, "isn't just about laws or verdicts. It's about people. It's about seeing what's true, even when our eyes try to fool us." The audience listened intently. He continued, "What happened to me in that courtroom wasn't just a mistake, it was a lesson. Not just for one judge, but for everyone who's ever made an assumption before knowing the story. The color of someone's skin, their clothes, their silence, none of it tells you who they are. Only their truth does. He paused, letting the words sink in. And sometimes, he added softly, it takes being judged unfairly to remind us how to judge fairly. The crowd erupted into applause, not the wild kind, but the kind that comes from deep respect. Back in his chambers, Judge Harrison happened to see the clip of that speech online. He watched it from beginning to end, his eyes glassy but smiling. When it finished, he whispered to himself, "He's right." In the months that followed, Harrison began mentoring other judges, teaching them the importance of patience and perception. His colleagues noticed his change and often asked, "What made you so different?" He would simply smile and say, "A mistake that became my greatest teacher." One afternoon, as he packed up after court, he noticed something taped inside his notebook, a small piece of paper he had kept since that day. The note Marcus had written, "We all make mistakes. What defines us is how we grow from them." He smiled softly, folded it again, and placed it back into his pocket, right over his heart. Outside, the sun was setting again just like that first day, but this time it looked different. The same golden light now felt warm, forgiving. The same walls that once echoed with authority now seemed filled with quiet wisdom. Justice had not been lost. It had simply evolved. And in every decision Judge Harrison made after that, in every word Marcus Reed spoke in court, that day's lesson lived on, a silent promise to see people for who they are, not what the world assumes them to be. It was no longer just about a judge and a prosecutor. It was about change, real human change. A courtroom that had once witnessed judgment had become a place of understanding. And from that moment forward, both men carried the same belief in their hearts, that true justice isn't spoken from the bench. It's lived through compassion.